So on that note, the author of two of my favorite books, The Women in Socialism, that everyone should check out, and Subterranean Fire, about the history of the American working class. And just as importantly, a leading member who has led the International Socialist Organization over the past couple of decades, and who, you know, I'm proud to say, even though the past couple of decades have been hard and they've been a slog, we're entering a period now where we're going to be able to really realize some of those goals that we've set out for ourselves and be able to begin to win some of the struggles that we've all been talking about and hoping about and dreaming about all weekend. So, Sharon Smith.
Oh boy. Thank you. Thank you. I'm close to tears at how amazing this conference has been. And I just want to say that I think one thing that this conference and its tremendous success has proven is that it is time for us to move on from having one or even two conferences for socialism each year. And in my opinion, we're ready to have one in the Deep South and in the Northeast. So I think that's where we're headed now. Yes, we are in a very new era. And actually, the historic moment that we find ourselves in right now only comes along very rarely. You know, when the gross inequality of the capitalist system is on full display for everyone to see. Now, to be sure, much of the capitalist class still doesn't seem to realize how much hostility is currently directed at them. It is unclear whether John McCain now accepts the fact that when he accused Barack Obama of being a socialist during the election campaign, all that did was make Obama all the more appealing, however untrue the accusation. And when Obama's not at all socialist budget was unveiled in February, Dirk van Dongen, yes, that's really his name, president of the National Association of Wholesale Distributors, he told the Wall Street Journal, for example, quote, "This budget is a forced march towards socialism, in my opinion," without trying to be dramatic about it. He said dramatically. And Dick Cheney, God bless him, he still doesn't seem to be aware that even though his own popularity, it was well below 12%, I believe, by the time he left office, every time he accuses the Obama administration of aiding and abetting terrorists, it's merely another reminder for all of us exactly why we're so overjoyed that Cheney no longer holds a public office in this country. Pretty much everyone by now acknowledges that this is not only the worst economic crisis, but also the worst ideological crisis for U.S. capitalism since the 1930s. Basically, when the profit system has been completely discredited in the eyes of so many millions of working class people. Now, for this reason alone, it's no exaggeration to say that we now face the greatest prospects for rebuilding the U.S. left since the Great Depression on the basis of massive class consciousness and class anger. Now, to state the obvious, it is to our advantage that so many people under the age of 30 currently believe that socialism is a better system than capitalism. And I also want to mention that although it is certainly very distressing to see the far right making gains in Europe in the recent elections, things here are not moving in that direction, but actually are moving well to the left. When we had our conference, our other conference in Chicago a couple of weeks ago, there was a big brouhaha on the internet with local Nazis, actually regional Nazis, threatening to call a huge protest outside and actually calling for a huge protest outside of our conference. And all that they managed to muster up, they even had a bus. It's so pathetic. They had a bus and nobody showed up to get on it. They barely managed to muster a pathetic trio, 3 of them. They had as many flags as they did picketers, and even the word picket, you have to put that in quotation marks, because when one of them had to run back to I saw this, when one of them had to run back to the car to get something, there were more flags than there were Nazis to hold them. My point being that there can be little doubt that social conditions tilt far in our favor at this particular historical juncture. Now, to say that the far right is marginalized today in this country is not at all meant to be a recipe for complacency, but on the contrary, to emphasize that there is no excuse for the left not to grow significantly in this new era, just as the socialist movement did in the 1930s. Now, there are, of course, lessons from the Great Depression that are tremendously useful for us as we build a new left today. Today, we face a situation in which 6 months into the Obama administration, the feds are still throwing hundreds of billions of dollars at the same Wall Street banks that caused the housing crisis, while millions of working-class Americans continue to lose their homes to foreclosure. And as yet, there has not been one federal dollar that went to bail out a single homeowner facing foreclosure. And they are getting away with it. We are well aware of that. The main source of outrage a lot of times seems to be coming from the crazies in the Republican Party, which only serves then to exaggerate Obama's successes, his accomplishments. Now, for this reason, some of the lessons of the Great Depression that are most useful for us today is not simply that the Great Depression was the single greatest era of class struggle and advance for the U.S. working class, but also what it took to get to that point. Now, what I want to show here is that, yes, there are some obvious parallels between the conditions that we face today and those that existed in the Great Depression, contrary to what many people believe. Because there's often a false impression that the stock market crashed in 1929, and by 1930, the working class was on the offensive, as if massive class struggle is an immediate product of economic crisis. And the truth is that it took years for the class struggle to advance in the 1930s. And actually, in the year 1930, real weekly earnings fell by 20% across all industries. There were, of course, some important class struggles that took place, not necessarily, some of them at the point of production, most of them not, in the early years of the Depression, the struggles of the unemployed, the struggles, neighborhood fights against evictions. But it's important to understand that most of these took place on a small scale. They did not involve struggle at the actual workplace, and maybe most importantly, they were of a temporary, the participation of people in these were of a temporary, not a long-term nature. So there was a constantly revolving door of people participating. It wasn't until several years later, in 1933, that the level of strikes began to rise significantly. It is very important to understand, I think, that conditions of mass unemployment do not immediately lead to mass resistance. On the contrary, they often lead to a sense of helplessness in the first instance, even for those workers who are lucky enough to still have a job, because of course they're afraid that if they rock the boat, that there's lines of unemployed people desperate to take their jobs. It isn't desperation alone that drives workers to struggle. As Todd just said, there has to be some sense that it is some sense of confidence that it's possible to actually win. And that sense of confidence often does not occur until at least some sections of the economy begin to pick up and start hiring again. And even after, in the 1930s, even after the tide began to turn in 1934 with the 3 strike victories in Toledo, San Francisco, and Seattle, it wasn't as if from that point on, it was onward and upward. Labor was on the offensive. Again, in reality, the 3 victories in the spring and summer of 1934, which were incredible, they were immediately followed by the defeat of the textile strike up and down the East Coast, which was one of the bloodiest assaults ever suffered by the U.S. working class. It wasn't until the victories of the sit-down strike wave in 1936 into 1937, and in particular the victory at the Flint sit-down strike that unionized General Motors, which was the equivalent then of what today would be the unionization of the anti-union Walmarts. You can imagine the significance. It was only at that point that you could say safely that the labor movement was taking the offensive in the class struggle. Now that was some 7 or 8 years into the Great Depression. And there is also a clear parallel between Obama's roughly first 100 days in office and the initial character of Roosevelt's New Deal in the early 1930s. As with Obama, the election of Franklin Roosevelt in 1932 brought hope for millions of working class families that relief was on the way. But Roosevelt did not immediately bring the kind of change that would put food on the table for workers or keep them in their homes. On the contrary, Roosevelt conducted a delicate balancing act. His rhetoric was very generous towards workers, but his budget was not. And only big business got significant relief in the early 1930s. It was only after the class struggle began to rise and the labor movement began to score those real victories in 34 that Roosevelt, and it should be pointed out that each and every one of those victories was led democratically by radicals in that year, 1934. It was only then that Roosevelt, upon running for re-election in 1935, began to consider it necessary to grant the first major reforms of his administration. In that year, Roosevelt finally granted Social Security, the first acknowledgement ever that the government has a responsibility to provide material aid to the poor, and he also signed the Wagner Act, finally making it illegal for employers to refuse to recognize the unions that their employees chose to represent them. In other words, there is now, and there was then, a direct correlation between the scale of the struggle from below and the scale of reforms that come from above. And Obama himself has said, you probably remember him saying, "You're going to have to pressure me." So pressure him we must. But we also have to keep in mind that history never repeats itself exactly. And just as today's economic crisis is not and could not be an exact repeat of the Great Depression, we also should not expect history to repeat itself identically when it comes to rebuilding either the labor movement or the left. There is no doubt that we lack certain advantages that existed in the 1930s. Probably most importantly, that the size of the left at the start of the Great Depression was much larger than what exists today, no doubt. In addition, large sections of workers at the start of the 1930s had either themselves or had parents and grandparents who trained them into traditions of the class struggle and the left-wing traditions of the IWW or the Socialist Party, whereas today we have a situation in which the U.S. labor movement has been in a state of virtual paralysis for the last 3 decades, the longest period of sustained retreat in U.S. history. The vast majority of young workers today not only work in low-wage, non-union jobs, or multiple low-wage, non-union jobs, but they have been cut off from the radical traditions that built the labor movement in the first place. That radical tradition now has to be learned through reading and discussion instead of the stories that are handed down from one generation to the next. You know, things like when union carpenters attend a demonstration, always make sure you got a big pocket full of nails when the horses arrive. It's very handy to throw those nails down on the street. Just a few of the little things trying to pass on to you young people. But actually, in other respects, we find ourselves far in advance politically from the era of the Great Depression. The struggles against oppression that took place in the 1960s, the struggle for civil rights and then black power, for women's liberation and gay liberation left a lasting imprint on U.S. society. And once that genie is out of the bottle, you can't put it back in. It is not only the fact that an electoral majority in the U.S. elected an African-American president in November, which would have been impossible even a decade ago, but also the fact that John McCain's campaign manager has come out in favor of same-sex marriage? Have you seen this? And he's urging the Republican Party to do the same? This speaks volumes for the changes in mass consciousness in today's world. The vast majority of people in this country have broken with the hate-based and conservative politics that allowed the Republican Party to dominate for the past 30 years, and instead people are embracing tolerance and social change. What we already see is that the struggle for gay marriage is, of course, a synthesis of the fight for civil rights and a working class demand. The struggle for immigrants' rights, of course, is a struggle for civil rights and also a working class movement. What we saw on May Day 2006, when millions of immigrant workers came out in a day without an immigrant, as its slogan, is just a glimpse of what is possible in the coming years in building a working class movement that stands for strong unions and also for social justice. Because the truth is, the rise of industrial unionism in the 1930s was a qualitative advance from the limits of craft unionism. No question about it. But it did not challenge Jim Crow segregation in the South. It did not challenge lynching, which was still the order of the day in the South. It did not even succeed at challenging the fact that the National Recovery Administration allowed Southern employers to pay black workers lower wages than white workers. In the end, industrial unionism failed when it came to organizing the South because it failed. The union movement failed to make the fight for unionization in the South also a fight against white supremacy. And for that reason alone, the South has remained a non-union, low-wage noose hanging around the neck of the U.S. labor movement. Because, truth be told, long before capital moved to the global South to escape unions, it was able to move to the deep South. So if we want to address the needs of today's labor movement, we have to move forward towards social justice movement and finally make a reality of the labor slogan that built the union movement in the first place. We have to make a reality of the slogan, an injury to one is an injury to all. And we have seen glimpses of this already, starting a few years back when the Massachusetts AFL-CIO backed same-sex marriage. And Massachusetts went on to become the first state to legalize same-sex marriage. Or at the Republic Windows and Doors struggle. Most people don't know this. When lesbian and gay LGBT activists came and supported the Republic Windows and Doors occupation, and Republic Windows and Doors in turn sent a representative to a mass meeting for fighting for equal marriage to express their solidarity with the fight for equal marriage. U.S. Labor Against War represented an important attempt toward putting the strength of organized labor behind opposition to the Iraq War. Now, if we begin to view the class struggle in this angle, then surely we will be able to fully appreciate why, even though the struggle for same-sex marriage does not involve a workplace struggle or a strike, winning it will mark the first victory for our class in the battles that lie in the years ahead. And while it is true that the scale of U.S. manufacturing, the U.S. manufacturing base has shrunk significantly over the last few decades, no doubt about it, that doesn't mean that new technologies have brought about a post-industrial society. Far from it. We can't aim to replicate bygone eras, but we have to learn to embrace the possibilities that exist in this new era. And I want to close by offering you the opportunity to create your own fantasy. I'm going to set it up for you. This is a class fantasy. I'm sorry. I should have made that clear. Okay, here we go. Just try to imagine a future moment when a major Fortune 500 company, you could pick your own favorite company for your fantasy after all, okay? And this major Fortune 500 company finds its internet completely shut down. This time not by a computer virus, but by a strike of its computer technicians. And they are then joined on the picket line by a walkout of mainly women clerical workers, who then turn around and convince the UPS drivers, delivery drivers, to go out on sympathy strike. All of them ready to fight to the finish to end the U.S. occupation of Afghanistan. And then maybe we can begin to imagine the future face of the class struggle in a history that has yet to be determined and a new left that has yet to be built. Thank you very much.